Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I'm also chair of the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. And I want to welcome you to the 30th event that we've held since we started this program in February of 2020. And I'm particularly pleased because this is a topic that I think is particularly important. And we're very, very privileged to have three leaders in the whole space related to voting and representation. And so the title of this is Asian American Career Ceilings Voting Representation. And why are we having this? Well, because a notable weakness on the part of Asian Americans historically has been having voting, but also having government representation at all different levels, whether it's local or federal, et cetera. And it's safe to say that we're not as strong in terms of this category as some other ethnic groups. And it's very important because the extent to which you don't have enough voting or enough representation, it affects your ability to have clout on issues that are important to the Asian American community. And so our three panelists will talk about what they perceive the problems along these lines, where they don't see problems, and what they think Asian Americans do to help and to try to make a difference. I won't read through all three of the biographies because it's on the invitation, but we have Christine Chen, who's the executive director and co-founder of American Pacific Islander American Vote, or APIAVote. We have Madalene Mielke, who's president and CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And we have Gregg Orton, who's National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. So we have three leaders in this space. They're not all the same. Each of their organizations have a different angle on this overall topic, but we have really quite a great panel to discuss this issue. The way we're going to do this is we're doing this as a fireside chat. And essentially, I will go through a list of some questions, and then it will be up to the panelists which ones they want to answer. But we're just going to make our way through, and we're going to try to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. And you can ask your questions principally by just typing questions in the chat box. So first, though, I'd like to help the audience by letting the panelists briefly explain what they do and their connection to the voting and representation issues, and directly or indirectly related to the career ceiling issue. So maybe we'll just start out alphabetically, last name. Maybe, Christine, you want to start?
Sure.
We'll mix it up along the way, so you won't always be first.
No, of course. So once again, Christine Chen, Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. We're the nation's leading organization focusing on building political power by increasing voter and civic participation. Our strategy is to really work with local trusted messengers and nonprofits in over 29 states to really help them build their capacity to integrate this type of work into their pre-existing structure. But also at the same time, recognize that elections don't happen once every 4 years or every 2 years, but there are actually local elections happening every single year. And also the work continues after Election Day in keeping elected officials accountable and what we could be doing in terms of increasing our civic participation.
Okay. Madalene, how about you're next?
Thanks, Peter. My name is Madalene Mielke. I'm the president and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. We were founded nearly 30 years ago by former Secretary Norman Y. Mineta and former delegate to Congress, Robert Underwood, alongside our sister organization, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, CAPAC, which is comprised of all of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander members of the United States House of Representatives and United States Senate. So the work that we do is to increase AA and NHPI representation across the political process, so from community advocate to elected leader. And we do that through our signature programs. And that really is a result of increasing and widening the pipeline. So we have a program that is focused for congressional internships, paid opportunities for college age students to participate on the Hill, and then congressional fellowships, which are also paid, which are a longer 9-month program, also hosted on the Hill and at various agencies and in the White House. And then we also have leadership academies, which we do regionally and nationally to encourage more local participation in running for office. So our goal is to demystify the process and make government more accessible to the AA and HPI community. And we do that through those 3 signature programs, but we also do it through other programs that encourage high school students. We have a high school program that brings high school students to Washington, D.C. to better understand public policy and the stakeholders and institutions that create it, so that they have a better understanding of how they too have a hand in creating public policy. A women's collective to encourage more AA and HPI women to enter public service and to run for public office. And so the programs that we have are all created to encourage our community to participate in ways that allow them to see themselves as elected leaders. And they're already community leaders already, and how they can see themselves in a different platform if they want to pursue public service.
Well, I love it when someone mentions Hawaiian, because I spent most of my childhood growing up in Hawaii, and I still can't figure out why I moved to the East Coast to live instead of staying there and surfing and freediving. Gregg, you're up next.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, everybody. Gregg Orton with the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. We are a coalition of now 47 of the largest Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander civil rights organizations in the country. And the best way to think about us is, we are the national brain trust, if you will, for the whole community. We have member organizations that have policy specific approaches, and we have member organizations that have community specific approaches to their work. And so both Christine and Madalene's organizations are members of the coalition. And really our job is to represent that unified voice for our broad community in DC. And so whether that means engaging with the White House or with CAPAC or members of Congress or federal agencies, our members are working together to make sure that our communities are heard and seen and really considered when policy decisions are being made. More as of late, certainly back in 2018, we realized that there was a need to do more when it comes to civic engagement. And that's really where we began to lean on both Christine's organization and Madalene's, and recognizing that, it can't just be policy work. We have to be able to connect those dots. And so again, NCAPA is that neutral space where lots of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander orgs can come together and be in principal disagreement at times, but most of the time we're finding ways to work together and again, present that unified front and sort of growing power for our community here in Washington, D.C. So it's a pleasure to be with you all, and happy to answer questions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's very important to have a voice, because if you don't have a voice, they won't hear you, right, Gregg? So let's start out. I'd like to start out with a big picture and just saying, focus first on voting. And that is, there really are, if we look at the voting situation with regard to Asian Americans in this country, I'd like the 3 of you, or any combination of you, to tell the audience, what is it that we know about how Asian Americans vote in this country, both at the local and the national level? And what do you see as the positive and negatives about what the data shows? So anyone can speak in whatever order they wish.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in since that is in my organization's name. So, before 2020, I used to say that you might as well assume that half of your family and friends within the AA and HPI community was ready to cast their ballot, but the other half was not. And luckily in 2020, there's a number of things that happened where we have the infrastructure, we have the resources, and also because of the pandemic and the rise of anti-Asian violence, I think the connection in terms of how government and elected officials make decisions on our daily lives actually had the AA and HPI community understanding the importance of getting involved with the elections. So as a result, we actually really increased and our voter registration rate from 56% to 63%. And our voter turnout rate actually increased by 10 percentage points to 60%. That's actually a larger jump than any other ethnic community. But at the same time, we still have a long way to go. We still are behind the white and Black community when it comes to voter turnout. But I would also
any benchmarks to how far behind are we?
So for the white community in 2020, they were their turnout was at 71%, and the African American community was at 63%. And so we're getting better, but at the same time, those are actually voter turnout. Where we actually really need to focus on is still where we're lacking behind is voter registration. So we have a lot of work to do, especially among 18 to 29-year-olds. I think many times when I'm talking to community settings, a lot of people are really focusing on the limited English proficient and the first generation immigrants, which, we definitely also need to make sure that we have translated culturally appropriate materials for those new type of voters. But at the same time, it's really the 18 to 29-year-old bracket where we actually have the lower participation rate. But the upside is that since 2018, we've seen a tremendous increase overall with our electorate, as well as the 18 to 29-year-olds. We saw that in 2020, but then we also saw that increase in 2022 as well. So, we are on the right trajectory. When you look at the census data, in 2020, we also know that our community is the fastest growing community. So even in states, 49 out of 50 states, we actually grew in double digits since 2010. So that means that we actually have a larger population that if we register, we can also make a difference in a lot of these elections. So right now, in terms of citizen voting age populations, in other words, they're U.S. citizens and those who are 18 and older, API registrants are actually growing at a rate of 1.28 times larger than our citizen voting age population, which is great because that means we're actually trying to catch up to our potential, right? And when you're looking for first-time voters, the campaigns and the political parties really need to look at the API electorate. For instance, in 2020, 23% of API voters were voting for the first time. And then even in battleground states like Nevada, North Carolina, Texas, it was as large as 25%, Georgia, 26%. So when these elections are being won by narrow margins, we need to be looking at the API electorate, and they need to be engaging more with our base of voters.
Yeah. And by the way, is that, the younger voters, the 18 above, the fact that they don't, Asian Americans, in that age group don't vote, as much, is that specific to Asian Americans, or is this also true for some of the other groups, ethnic groups?
I mean, overall, typically, especially 18 to 24-year-olds have a lower voter participation rate. But if you were to compare 18 to 24-year-olds when there were the millennials or Gen X or baby boomers, the Gen Z is actually doing a lot better than any of the other generations. So they actually are turning out a lot higher, but overall, it is still lower currently. I will say that for AAPI youth, it is lower than African American, white, and Latino. So that's why we still need to do a lot more work and also investments. The reason why we also have a lot more to catch up is because we only started investing and doing this type of work probably in the last 10 to 15 years, right? Yeah. Versus like the African American community, they've been doing this for decades, right? And so that's why it really goes back to how can we make sure that investors, foundations, individual donors are also paying attention to investing in our community.
Yeah. Okay, Madalene and Gregg, any comments about, what the data shows about Asian American voting and the positives and negatives?
I would just add, just to make sure any of our viewers are not in that 18 to 29 age bracket and feeling blamed for any of this. I think to Christine's point, we've seen rapid growth of the last 10 years across the community. And it's really about how do we capture that energy and really harness it to take ourselves to that next step. Because I think there's more and more folks in our community who are starting to understand and starting to see the real impact that can be had when people vote, when communities get together and demonstrate their power to elected officials. And so, yes, we certainly want more young people to be engaged because they very much are the future, but really across the entire community. It's the real question for us is, can we sort of sustain this momentum that we've seen? And yeah, sometimes it's hard to see election to election, but I would even say over the last couple election cycles, we've seen real progress being made in specific states and races. And being someone who, worked on the Hill for a long time, working for a member from Houston, we saw that growth as well, just in terms of the recognition that the community itself was actually getting more politically engaged.
Mm-hmm. Madalene, any comments, or should move to the next
Yes,
question?
I absolutely do. I think in the sense of the work that APIAVote does with its election survey, we also know from that information that when you have more Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders on the ballot, you will have more of our community coming out to vote. And so that's why APAICS encourages our community to run for public office, because then it's a result too of a positive result of seeing more of our community being actively engaged, and seeing that also is a product of more people who are interested in becoming elected officials. And so 2018, we saw in that election 5 Hmong Americans get elected into the Minnesota state legislature. We saw that in the recent election where Oregon had 5 Vietnamese Americans. So we're talking about new Americans who are also immigrants who are running for office, who have not been in this country for very long and feel like they have an opportunity to make a difference by serving as an elected leader. And that in turn energizes and motivates our communities to come out to vote, because they see themselves as someone who has a shared lived experience or narrative that they can also say, this is a person who will understand my particular point of view or perspective from that shared experience. So for us, it's so important to encourage our community to see themselves as elected leaders. And so the programs that we have are meant to encourage and inspire them to meet other people who have been successful and those who haven't been successful, but continue to still serve in other capacities. So I think the work that we all do in regards to making sure that voter registration is happening, and then it turns into how are we becoming a vocal member of the community by having more elected leaders, it just motivates the entire community.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting because so many of the topics that we've had under this program, the Committee 100 program on Asian American career ceilings, so many people have made the comment that, you can't just lump everyone together as Asian American, Pacific, and Asia Pacific Islanders. There's some real differences, whether you're Indian American, Japanese American, Chinese American, and so forth. Just on the voting behavior, do any of the three of you see differences as you go below the overall Asian American? You think about the subgroups, East Asian, South Asian, Indian, Chinese, Korean, and so forth. Any differences that you see with regard to voting behavior?
Yeah, so since 2012, APIAVote, along with Asian American Advancing Justice, AJC, and now more recently with API Data, we've been conducting a pre-election in-language survey. What we realized is back in 2012 is that one of the reasons that we were not getting the investments or recognition in the press was because we didn't have any hard data, because we're always missing from the surveys and the research that's being done on the electorate. So with the 2012 Asian American Voter Survey, since then, we conduct this every 2 years. And along with that is a question about party identification. So, right now, typically the Democrats actually have the majority of Asian American, I should say specifically, because the survey is only of Asian American voters, actually are leaning toward Democrats. But we're also are seeing at 35% are identifying now as independent voters. And the growing number is actually coming from the Chinese community at 47%. So the largest segment of the Chinese community is identifying as independent voters. Even with the Vietnamese community, which typically are supporting more Republican candidates, we're also seeing 46% that are identifying as independent. So what's telling us is that heading into the 2024 elections, it really is more about the issues, because then when we also ask questions about issues, healthcare, jobs, and economy continue to be at the top of mind for these voters. But at the same time, inflation and crime has actually crept up, as well as gun control and environment. And then there's also a distinction among younger voters where gun control and environment actually continues to increase as a top of mind issue for them to focus on. When we're also looking at party evaluation, there's also, what we're also seeing among the different voters is that within the Asian American voters, depending on the issue, they could range from 28% to 35%, feel like there's no difference between Democrats or Republicans on different issues, whether it's inflation, foreign policy, national security, crime, jobs and economy, and onward. So that also tells us that the political parties and the candidates need to do more work and engagement with our electorate to actually differentiate themselves. But overall, I would say, yes, there is some differentiation between the different ethnic communities. Like I said, with the Vietnamese population, typically identifying more as Republican, but like I said, that is changing. And then, but overall, the Asian American voters are identifying more as Democrats. But no party should take that as something for them to sit on, because they really need to continue to engage with this base of voters.
Yeah, and so you think issues and other things are a big issue with regard to motivating people to vote, et cetera, and I guess that can vary, right, year by year as well, right?
Well, so that's why it goes back to that they're not, our community, especially when you look at from a historical vantage point, is that they're not necessarily identifying as heavily with the political parties. It's really more about where that party or where that candidate stands on the issues. So they're really focusing on their issues and whether or not they're engaged, that party or that candidate is also investing in engaging with this particular voter.
Yeah. No, I remember, Gary Locke, who is the chairman of Committee 100 and was the governor of the state of Washington, but also, Secretary of Commerce and Ambassador to China. I was talking to him, and he talked about when he first ran, right, to be governor, and he said it wasn't about appealing to the Asian American voters. It was appealing to all families with regard to what they thought were important to them economically, family, and so forth. And we see a lot of that. So, that's, he said, it doesn't mean I didn't want to have the Asian American vote, but that wasn't the motivator in how I won. Any other comments about this thing, which is whether there's some differences? I will say that anecdotally, a number of people have said that they do feel that there's a little bit better voter turnout and motivation among Indian Americans versus Japanese and Chinese, et cetera. But that's just anecdotal. Do you think that's true or not?
So you know what? It's really not necessarily about ethnicity as in terms of language access. So what we are finding is that between language access and also where they reside in what state and whether or not that state makes it easier or harder for you to access the ballot. So for instance, Hmong Americans, where a large segment of them reside in Minnesota, where they have same-day registration, automatic registration, where you could early vote, they make it really accessible. Voter turnout among the Hmong community is quite high, right? And maybe you will see in Japanese American and Indian American voters also voting at higher rates because their English capabilities is a lot better versus what you'll see in Vietnamese, Chinese, and Korean. So where you're going to have a larger different segments of the population where we're going to need more translated materials, right? So I would actually note that. maybe Madalene or Gregg would want to comment more about their political fundraising. I think that's a little bit different than what I'm seeing in terms of voter turnout.
Okay, so you think language is a big determinant of turnout between different ethnicities? Yeah, I guess that, because I'm making a distinction about different ethnicities. So you say at the same city or so forth, that there's a difference among ethnicities, Asian American ethnicities, because of the language issue?
So what we have seen in terms of studies is that those who are limited English proficient actually have a lower turnout rate than those who are English proficient. So that is one of the things. And then the other one I was like saying is depending on where these large segments of these different ethnic communities, if they reside in a state where it's more accessible to actually be able to vote versus another area where they're making it harder for you to actually cast your ballot.
Well, but let me ask the question again, because I understand the language issue by, city or whatever it is, but say in the same city, using that where they have the same language accessibility policies, are there differences between Indian, Japanese, Chinese Americans, et cetera?
Yeah, you know what? I wish I could say I have all that data, but unfortunately, right now with there aren't that many resources in terms of doing research. So there's only so much that we're able to cobble together. So for us to actually dig deep into a particular state. But what I would want to differentiate is what you may see in terms of voter engagement versus political organizing and political funders, because we do know that in terms of fundraising, there's been a lot more Indian Americans that have been very much organized, especially the last couple of presidential cycles, in terms of getting their community more engaged in that manner.
Yeah, well, there was a big article on this recently, I think the New York Times, so forth, pointing out exactly what you're saying, which was that at least the last 5 to 10 years, that the Indian American community has become very active in terms of fundraising, generating candidates, and trying to get people into office. And you look at this, look at how many Indian Americans are now in Congress and Senate, or Kamala Harris is is part Indian, and vice president. So it's noticeable in terms of the data. But if that is that article, I mean, Madalene and Gregg, is that article correct? I think it was in the New York Times. Is it correct to say that among, and maybe there's a lesson to be learned, by the other Asian American groups? Is it true or not, Gregg, Madalene?
So I would say that when you look back at the Japanese American community, they became much more involved after the internment. And so I think this is sort of the evolution of the Asian American community as we start to data disaggregate ethnicities. The Indian American community understood that they needed to organize themselves to see more Indian Americans elected into office. And so they began to organize through fundraising in support of other candidates, as well as candidates from within their own ethnicities. And so all of this is to say is that a lot of people within the Asian American community will see within ethnicity support only from their ethnicity and will not support other Asian American groups if we're talking about the umbrella label. And so in that sense, for us as a community to work together in coalition, it's more of an understanding for us to see that significance wise for us to have more Asian Americans overall elected into office. And so when you look at the different ethnic groups who've made a plan to support because they said we need to have a voice, this is a historical situation that continues on. And so, I think the Indian American situation is just another example of that.
Yeah, and I think if you talk to leaders in the Jewish community and the African American community, they will point out that they have worked very hard to try to punch above their weight, right? And by fundraising, by encouraging people to run for office and so forth. So I think part of the story here is that Asian Americans as a group, but also within ethnicities, clearly the signals are that we should be doing more of that. I'd like to switch over to this issue from voting to people running for office, right? And it does appear, that Asian Americans are seriously underrepresented in terms of elected and appointed government positions, both at local and federal levels. And a lot of speakers over the last 3 years we've had speakers who were, Alan Tong, who was a mayor of Cranston and ran for Congress, and Andrew Yang was a speaker, and he talked about these issues. So there seems to be that feeling that not enough Asian Americans are running for office. Do you feel that's true? And if so, do you have a feeling as to why that's true?
Yeah, I can start. And I mean, certainly want to recognize the work that Madalene and APEX has done in helping build the pipeline compared to where we were a decade ago. It's just drastically different. And so even still, I think we all agree that it's always good when more of our community feels empowered to run. I can speak from my experience from working on the Hill. When I was there, there was probably a dozen Asian American members of Congress. And now, Madalene, you'll have to correct me on the exact number, but I know that number is significantly higher, well over 20. And so there is progress. But I think for me, and certainly my observation is like communities have to believe that they can have impact, right? When you're an immigrant to this country and you sort of arrive, a lot of these systems have already been built, have existed for a long, long time, and you're just trying to find your way. I think what we see is when communities start to believe and start to see that they can, again, organize themselves and suddenly have influence on the outcomes of, elections, that's when you really start to see growth. And a good example is not everywhere across the United States, but there's certainly cities and local races where if a candidate organized their community, they could probably win a local race. It only takes a couple thousand votes. And so we've seen more and more examples of sort of that belief starting to break through with communities. And that's why I think we're starting to see more and more candidates and also more and more wins. But overall, yes, I think we're still at a place where we want to see more Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders run, and also have the community show up for them as well.
Any comments from either of you?
So I would also include, and thank you, Gregg, for the comments on APAICS. In recent years, when you look at the last election cycle of 22, the outcome of that was we had 169 state legislators out of 7,300 seats across the country, and of that, only 69 of those people are women who are Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and so even I would say looking at Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women in elected office is a huge disparity. When you think at one time we had 3 members of the United States Senate. And so this is a huge disparity for us as a community because of the fact that when you look at how elected office is even created, it's a part-time legislature. It's a part-time elected position. You're asking people to do even more than what they're already doing in their regular lives. And so this is an educational awareness for our community as well, is to say that, yes, we understand that you are taking on an added burden in becoming an elected official. That also means that you are providing that representation and diverse voice of what it means to be Asian American in your community that may have been missing in the past. And so even now, when you talk about asking someone to run for office, and especially a woman, it's 7 to 9 times you have to ask that person. And so you're adding on top of it the fact that you're asking an Asian American person to run for office and explaining to them, yes, I'm asking you to run for office in a seat that only pays you maybe $5,000 and you have to work for 90 days. So there's so much involved in about just saying, hey, I want to run for office, because not everyone's going to run for Congress. And if you want to run for your state legislative seat, you have to see what the qualifications are, but also what are the benefits? Like, why would you even do this? And so there has to be a values proposition for our community to see the value and the worth of why they should even run for office, because what do they get out of it? What they're getting out of it is this opportunity to support the community and provide a different voice. So the educational awareness program is why APAICS does this from a high school program to mid-career, because you have an opportunity to be an elected official or someone to sit on a board or a commission in an appointment without running for office and still provide that diversity and that lived experience as an AA and HPI.
And I just want to also,
I just want to make one comment, but one of the problems has nothing to do with ethnicity, which is it's become so much harder personally to run for office, whether it's how much money you have to raise. 100 years ago, you didn't have, it didn't cost $2 billion to have a presidential race, for example. But the other is, for better or worse, the amount of scrutiny and media scrutiny and all this other stuff that's happened. So, and this has nothing to do with being Asian American. It's been harder and harder to get good people to want to run for office, no matter what their ethnicity is. So, that's part of the problem, but it's not a specific Asian American problem. But in terms of specific Asian American, do you perceive that the current problem of the Asia hate, which is partly due to this clash between the US and China, do you think that is, number one, in any way discouraging Asian Americans from running? But the other side is, do you think it's diminishing their chance of winning?
I'll answer a little bit. Part of it is that I would say that the attacks and the escalation of the U.S.-China rhetoric, but also in terms of how state legislative laws, especially alien land laws, are being introduced in a number of states, is actually galvanizing a new base of voters, especially Chinese immigrant voters, that in the past, they may not necessarily have been involved as much, but now those that have organized against these pieces of legislation, they're now reaching out to APIAVote asking, like, can you go ahead and actually plug us into your programs? How can we learn how to increase voter registration? And they're very much focusing in on yielding their power in 2024 and beyond, and making sure that elected officials understand that they are part of this greater electorate that can make a difference, and that they cannot be passing legislation and policy like this. And I'll leave it at that and let Madalene and Gregg weigh in.
Well, that's an interesting point. And in fact, a lot of these groups have been very successful in trying to stop some of these crazy legislative moves, right? Like in Texas and so forth. Comments from Gregg or Madalene?
Yeah, I would simply add that I think, the wave of anti-Asian racism that we've seen over the last few years that is likely to continue, it all goes back to this idea that we've been talking about, where communities and individuals have to believe that they can have impact on the system that they're living in. And I think, to Christine's point, we have seen more and more state and local API groups emerge, right? Interested in pushing back on some of these narratives, interested in learning more about how to get more politically engaged. And I think the real challenge, to Madalene's point, is, can we find individuals who feel inspired, or quite honestly angered enough to respond to all of this hate, to really take the opportunity to run for office? And I think that really is the question. And so I, being the optimist, want to believe that we'll see more positives as far as the response to the hate, and more of our community feeling like they need to do something about it through the electoral process or through running for elected office. And those are narratives and stories that are quite compelling. We've seen many times through the election cycles, when someone shows up and can tell their story from a genuine point of view, it really does capture the imagination of voters, and it's something that people can empathize with, and it's something that, again, really can move voters at the poll.
Yeah. The reason why I picked this topic is because, one, it's very important, but also because there is a connection with the career ceilings issue. And I'll give you one example, and I'd like each of the three of you to say where you see the connection of doing better or worse, depending on the career ceiling side, depending upon how successful we are in voting and representation. So one good example is this. California, they passed some rules about what companies in California had to do with regard to diversity of their board of directors. I think you're all quite familiar with that. The only problem was that the way they passed the law, it really actually did not really help Asian Americans that much, because the companies could fulfill the requirements by just filling it with, the way they worded the law, by filling it with certain ethnic groups, so forth, but it didn't really help Asian Americans. And this was pointed out by a lot. So, again, this is a career ceiling thing, right? Because being on the board of companies is part of success, right, for Asian Americans. And yet here's a law that got passed that had good intentions, but indirectly made it so that it really didn't help Asian Americans. Maybe it actually hurt, because then to get certain credit, under the law, it actually pushed out Asian American candidates. And so either on that issue, but on the broader issue of what do you think, what other connections do you see between this voting and representation and the Asian American career ceilings problem that's being experienced in this country?
I'll add into that overall question. It's really about data disaggregation. It's really about understanding that there are people within our community that do not have the resources and have huge disparities in education and in healthcare and all of the issues that people run through day to day. And that data disaggregation information really highlights why it's so important to see Asian Americans as a community of color. And a lot of times people see us as secondary to the white community or Caucasians, because of the fact that they can't differentiate that. And so in the essence of data disaggregation, it's a better understanding for us to see where we have these disparities, and also to see how is it that we can build resources to support those members of our community. And that in effect draws across representation, it draws across our elected officials, and it draws across how we engage the community so that they can become active citizens. And so that leads into language access, and that leads into the things and the resources that we need to be able to address these individual situations for our constituencies.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments on this issue of career ceilings linked to voting representation?
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with Madalene said. I think there's still a lingering perception that our community, because we've been less politically engaged, because we're viewed sometimes unfairly, sometimes fairly, from a cultural perspective of, those stereotypes about being quieter, and even within our own families, conversation or communities talking about just putting our heads down and getting the work done and working hard. The reality is, like, there are many inequities that impact our community, and we as a collective whole need to get more upset about it. We need to get more willing to go out there and say something and challenge people to rethink how they view our community, challenge some of these companies that think that diversity just means a couple communities of color, not ours, right? I think in many ways, that's very much the work that all of our organizations are doing, and all the work that the APIAVote Coalition is doing, as well as C100, right? It is really pushing to change that narrative around who we are and how we're perceived. And it does require, at least in my opinion, some degree of being willing to express that frustration and being unafraid to sort of call it out when you see that inequity.
Yeah, well, certainly in general, Asian Americans are not taught, at least in older generations, to be aggressive and speak out and so forth. So I think that's true. Although I've been told by my younger Asian American friends that aggressiveness is increasing among the young Asian Americans, but I don't know if that's absolutely true or not. Madalene, any comments on this thing about any further comments on this issue of the linkage of career ceilings and the voting side?
One thing I might add is, while we should be more aggressive and willing to speak out, I don't think that necessarily means, I want to be careful about the connotation of aggressive, right? Because there's lots of ways in which we can engage and push companies, push member of Congress, push leaders and other communities to see us more accurately. And it doesn't necessarily have to be aggressive. It could be tactical. It could be strategic. Just the other day, the three of us were having conversations with folks in the White House about how they perceive the community on a whole host of issues. And that was purposely done in a way that's quiet and thoughtful, but also very pointed in the terms of the recommendations we were making. And so I do think it requires a degree of community maturity to recognize when is the moment to get mad, when is the time to organize in that way, and when are the moments in which we can pull on other levers and sort of use different points of access to push for the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah. And when I use the word aggressive, I didn't mean it in the negative sense of, pushing or yelling and screaming, because believe me, I know some people who are aggressive, extremely soft-spoken, but very effective, right? So it does. I didn't mean to connotate that it means you're trying to be, overtly aggressive in that sense. Any other comments on this before we move on to the next at all? Any comments, Christine?
Yeah, I just also want to really reemphasize that how politics and political empowerment impacts the economic levers, as well as how it influences our friends over in media, entertainment, and narrative change is all we actually all influence one another. So, I see that with the 2020 census, we actually got a full count, and we saw the increase of our population. And then we also saw the increased voter participation, especially in battleground states in the 2020 elections. And then when we were faced with all the rise of anti-Asian violence, I think we were in a better position to get the elected officials to pay attention to address those issues because of what was just done in terms of the elections, in terms of being counted in the census. And so, I just want to remind how this is all very intersectional and how we all, each of these sectors actually influence one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have some questions here, but I'd like everyone here, or our panelists, to make a statement about the following question, which is, what do you think the members of the audience, the people who are on, what do you think that they can do as individuals to help the voting and representation challenges and the impact on career students problem, to the extent there's a linkage? What advice would you give to the audience? And I'll let each of you, share your pearls of wisdom.
I can jump in first. I would say encourage your network of friends and family to check their voter registration and see if those who are in need of update to help them through that process. And I'm sure APIAVote has a lot of resources on their website to be able to do that. Also, in terms of a company perspective, if you are a member of an employee resource group, to encourage your senior leadership to engage with the employees of your company, and specifically through outside of Asian Heritage Month, to be able to encourage them to see this as a way to bring in speakers, to encourage public service and civic engagement. We do this quite a bit in speaking to ERGs about what does it mean to have diversity and representation in public service, and how they can support the work that we do by encouraging their networks to take a look of being actively involved when it comes to lobby days, when it comes to talking about the work that they are doing within their companies.
Mm-hmm. Gregg or Christine, advice you would give to our audience?
I would say just continue to lean in to C100. My understanding is that you all, have sort of a governing process where decisions are made through its members. And I would say for those who see issues that they care about and feel like an organization can do more, use your voice there, right? Because I can say again, when members of Congress, when state and local offices and elected officials hear from community organizations, they will pay attention if they have constituents in those states or in those communities. And so I think recognizing again that we do in fact have power, and when we do use our voice, like Peter said in the beginning, we're heard, and when we don't, we won't be, is really key. And I think C100 is uniquely positioned based on the membership of the organization to really be heard in a way that's really needed in this moment, given the tensions that exist between the U.S. and China, and are again likely to continue.
Yeah, well, we certainly do that where, as much as we can. And I think there are a number of Committee 100 members who are very active and influential at government levels, so forth. In fact, in about a week or so, a number of them will be down in DC speaking with senior government officials. So, Madalene, you go ahead. Christine, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No, so I would say that each of you are influential among your own family and friends, right? Your own networks. Like I said, before 2020, I would say half of your family or friends are registered and the other half are not. So you should still go with that assumption, and that it's really about, now that you've heard this, use this as a conversation starter with them. We need to actually talk about politics and policy and issues and help them connect the dots on a day-to-day basis. So that way they are not overwhelmed when it comes to the 2024 cycle or the elections, right? You also have the influence to make sure that they are provided the correct information and to fight back dis and misinformation. It's really that one-on-one relationship that you have. You're going to be that trusted messenger that can overcome some of the things that they're going to see on social media or on the WeChats. And so it's really about having you get engaged. And the best way to do that is also follow each of our organizations on social media. All of us typically throughout the year have a call to action for different things. So for example, this week and yesterday was National Voter Registration Day. If you were following us, we were actually providing direct ideas about how you can actually get and talk about voter registration and making sure that you check your own registration, right? And so we have a different number of things for you to actually participate in. But once again, yield your own personal relationships and lean in on that.
Okay. Now we have a lot of questions here. We have 10 questions. And so we won't be able to go through all of them, but let me pick some that are particularly interesting. Someone says, I'm curious how Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans are affected by misinformation during political campaigns compared to other ethnic racial groups, ? So I guess it's asking, do any of the panelists either feel that they have some information or data along these lines and an opinion about the question?
So both APIAVote as well as we're part of one of the committees within NCAPA. We we actually have a staff member focusing on mis and disinformation. So we actually analyze on a weekly basis what are the trends around mis and disinformation as it's related to the elections. We do see that there is more and more engagement on WeChat, Kakao, WhatsApp, and in language, right? And it is a problematic because many times those are closed off circles where you can't just have a random person go in to monitor all that. So that means we actually need all of you as volunteers to actually enter into those spaces, talk to your moms and dads and extended families to get into those spaces to help monitor that, and then to also introduce in language material to actually confront that or to actually provide the correct information.
Mm-hmm. Madalene, Gregg, any thoughts on that question?
I mean,
you don't have
misinformation, disinformation's impacting everybody. It's not just Asian Americans.
Yes, yes.
To Christine's point, I mean, there are specific ways in which it shows up in our communities. And yes, it is on us to work to try to address that and get good information out there so that we have more well-informed folks in our community.
Yeah, no, that's right. Here's a question from one of the attendees that says, how can Asian Americans enhance their political skills at different levels, workplace, community, national, etc.? I'll let the panelists answer, but I will cite one other member of the Committee 100, Mielke Tom, who was based in California. And I recall her talking during one of these panels about the efforts that they made in California to provide education for people who are potentially, running for office about how legislature works and how how you run for office and what are the fundraising rules and things. And then once they're in, how to function effectively. So, so she talked about that, but also the need for these kinds of tools and learning tools to be populated throughout the US, right? Since she started and led the one in California. So any panelists, again, how can Asian Americans enhance their political skills at different levels?
So with APAICS, we have a very similar situation. As Mielke spoke of her experience, I think I was actually on that panel with her. And so with APAICS, what we do is we have regional leadership trainings. We actually have one next week in California, in San Diego, and we travel across the country and also have a National Leadership Academy where we typically bring people to Washington, D.C. for those who are interested in running for office. So the opportunities are pretty wide and vast if you visit the APAICS website. And I think it's important for us to also understand not just elected office, but also, boards and commissions, a lot of Secretary of States within their websites will also list boards and commissions and opportunities of when to apply for those applications. APAICS, we have a resource library that actually has a lot of videos and YouTube on our YouTube channel that explains a lot of this work, and also interested in working in the administration and CAPA and APAICS, we have a job bank. So please feel free to take a look at our individual websites. You can also see all that information on our social media as well.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, that's right. I remember that panel. It was really great to hear what Madalene, what you had to say. Any other comments on this by the other panelists? Okay, now I have one that probably it's a difficult question to answer, but I'll read it. I'm of Asian descent and also a registered voter. I'm torn. The issue is that I would like to support Asian candidates, but of late the candidates do not fit my party affiliation. In situations as, what should I do? It's kind of an unfair question, but I thought I would ask it anyway, read it to you anyway.
Well, I think the reality is that, especially in places like California, you're also having Asians running against other Asians, right? The thing is, as our community has grown and evolved and become more sophisticated, I think it really is more about, does your values really align with that candidate? It's really goes beyond your ethnic affiliation, but it's really about the values and what solutions that candidate is providing to you versus the other candidate. Mm-hmm. And that's the advice that APIAVote typically also, when we do voter education, that is what we highlight. And so that's why it's really always about, how do we educate our voters about what these candidates are, what do they have to offer?
Any other comments? There's one question here, which is just asking, what do you perceive is being done by the federal government currently? And they said the current administration with regard to trying to, to try to help solve this Asian American career ceilings problem. I mean, this is not a voting, question, but it's a legitimate question that maybe the three of you might have an opinion.
Yeah, I would go back to the resume bank that Madalene mentioned, that NCAP and APEX have been essentially managing since the beginning of the Biden administration. And I want to be fair to the Biden administration. I think they've made some really significant strides in making sure that their administration looks and reflects the diversity of the country. There are many Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander appointees throughout the government. There's a number of high-ranking officials that are from our community as well. And so I would say, more to the question about the private sector, there are ongoing conversations with the administration about how we respond to the recent Supreme Court decision and what are the implications of that in the private sector. And I think, they've been very receptive and recognize the importance of making sure that we don't back away from investments and efforts made related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm very hopeful that they'll continue to sort of be outspoken on that. But I do think it is worth recognizing that they have one of the most, if not the most diverse administrations in history.
Yeah. Well, look, we always like to start on time and end on time, and we're a minute away from 5 o'clock. First of all, I do want to thank our three panelists, and we did achieve what I had hoped, which is three very knowledgeable but diverse opinions with the three. And Christine, I want to help thank you for your efforts to help put this panel together. I also want to say that this is a huge problem and it's complicated. And I think, as you have heard from the three panelists, there are lots of things driving all this behavior and so forth. But the reality is, I think their message is, it matters. Voting matters. Going and voting matters. But also, if you think you can deal with, making 5,000 for, for, X number of days of work or whatever. Try to do things that, try to think about running for office. Think about making a difference. I know it's a hard decision because there's so many negative things associated with running for office or even being in office. But particularly on the increment, and I think that's a comment that a number of people, I think Christine, you made, which is you don't have to be the majority, but if you have enough so that you can impact on the increment, it can make a huge difference. I mean, look, right now in the Senate and Congress, 2 or 3 people are pretty much, having a huge impact on where the Senate and Congress ends up. So think about that. It doesn't have to be the total, the total numbers. So one thing, I'll just ask the panelists. Each of you has a chance to make one last comment if you wish, or not, before we close. Optional. Okay, all right. Well, given that, I want to thank everyone. I also want to just mention to everyone that we will continue to have this program, but we are thinking about, there are 2 things I want to mention. There will be a session where we're going to electronically allow all the young and middle, and people connect with the leaders of these different organizations electronically in kind of an electronic ballroom. So please, you expect an invitation to that in the future. The other is where we have our annual Committee 100 annual conference and gala, and the date has now been set for April 19th. And so we hope that all of you join it. And the reason I mention it is that we're going to have one track which is totally focused on domestic issues such as voting and discrimination, etc. So this general topic you care about. It's an event that you might want to attend. So I want to thank all of you. And for those of you who like to binge watch, this recording will be on the Committee of 100 website. I know Gregg will try to force his family to watch it over and over again, right, Gregg? Right? So it's going to be available, and it'll also be available to those people who signed up but couldn't make it today for one reason or the other. So thank you very much. Again, thank you to panelists, and we look forward to all of you in the audience at our next event.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all. Thank you so
And
much.
what